Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, it's the epic tale of the rise and fall of one of America's most powerful Indian tribes. But it's also the intimate story of a mother and her children. I talk with author Sam Gwynne about his book, Empire of the Summer Moon, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. That's Dialogue. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. Sam Gwynne was a self-described Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court when he moved to Texas as a reporter. But he quickly fell in love with the state, particularly the vast plains of North Texas, nearly 50,000 square miles of shortgrass prairie and canyons. As he traveled the area, Gwynne learned about the story of Cynthia Ann Parker, a 9-year-old girl who was kidnapped by the Comanche tribe around 1836. Parker spent 24 years with the tribe and gave birth to 3 children with her husband, a Comanche. One of those children, Quanah, would go on to become the Comanche's most powerful warrior of that era. Gwynne, whose previous books had been about banking issues, was so struck by the story that he decided to write about the Comanches and the Parkers. The resulting book, Empire of the Summer Moon, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 2011. I spoke with Gwynne about his book at the Sun Valley Writers Conference. Since 1995, the conference has been bringing together authors and artists to discuss their works and issues of the day. I started by asking Gwynne why the stories of the Comanches, Cynthia Ann Parker, and Quanah aren't more widely known. I have to say, I'm kind of embarrassed. When I read your book, I thought to myself, why did I not know this story? Do you hear that often?
I hear it all the time, and it describes me. That is me, and that's why I wrote the book, because I'm your classic kind of Connecticut Yankee who comes to Texas in this case and sort of too dumb to know any better. And I came down and I started hearing this stuff about these people that are in the book, Comanches and others. And I had the same reaction. Why don't I know any of these people? Why have I never heard of this? Why isn't this front and center in the American myth? Why isn't it there? And why aren't some of these people like Davy Crockett, household names? Reason to write the book. And also, frankly, from a purely practical point of view, a writer sitting there knowing that he has an idea that no one in New York's ever heard of, which is where they're going to buy it, of course, is a pretty good deal. So you take a project and you say, hey, I've got these guys that you all never heard of before. There have been books. I mean, it isn't the first book ever done about it, but a lot of the books were done by smaller academic presses that don't get wide circulation. And
a movie perhaps loosely based on this story
as well. And there was some movies, yes. There were some John Wayne movies that had Comanches in them. But Comanches were very, to me as a kid, it was, I knew the Apaches, or I thought I did much better from the movies. The Comanche was the buzzword for danger. It was like, Sergeant, that's a Comanche arrow, and then you knew you were in trouble. But it was kind of a code word, and they never got much deeper than that.
Why do you think we don't know more about this story in the United States?
That is another question, and that's harder to say. There was, Custer is a classic example of why we have heard of somebody. And the reason we've heard of Custer is Custer traveled with press corps. Custer was a media hound. Custer understood all those things. And so you get a guy like Ranald Mackenzie, who is one of the heroes, if you will, of my book, who was actually probably the greatest Indian fighter, as opposed to Custer, who's one of the worst. Nobody's ever heard of Ranald Mackenzie. A Crazy Horse surrendered to Ranald Mackenzie. Mackenzie beat the Cheyennes, the Comanches. I mean, he was a major Indian fighter. He operated in a part of the world where there were no newspapers. He didn't have his press corps. He wasn't a media hound. One of the ways that actually, if you were going back to the military side of this anyway, the way you enhance yourself is by writing long, flowery, elaborate military reports about this incredible battle that you engaged in. These people out here in the Texas frontier didn't do that. And so there was a bit of that too. As for why someone like Quanah is not known, but Geronimo is, I think the answer there is probably that Geronimo did this one thing that was very focused, that happened over a period of time where he took a very small band and eluded a very large army. And it was something that you can kind of put your hands around. Quanah didn't have quite quite as focused a piece. You know, Quanah to me is the greater man in all ways, but it was, if you will, spread out a little bit. And the Red River War was a very hard war to quantify.
But for Texans, this is a story that they know, yes? And in fact, some of them can still intimately relate to it.
Yeah. No, it is. And if you go back, the funny thing about this whole book is that maybe nobody in New York's ever heard of it, but back in the 1930s, every Texas school child knew who Cynthia Ann Parker was. Who was Cynthia Ann Parker? She was the little girl who was taken from the frontier in 1836, the year of Texas independence, and she was taken to the Comanches, and she was adopted by them, and she refused to come back. You know, she was the white squaw who refused to come back. And she assimilated, she married a chief, she had children, her son became the greatest chief of the Comanches. So when you had this story kind of built into Texas folklore and Texas history that everybody knew. And I think sometimes these stories just kind of go out of currency because no one has come back and told them, you know, kind of recently.
And that was another thing. I didn't realize that there had been so many people kidnapped, so many young white girls and women
and boys
kidnapped, and young men taken, sometimes ransomed, sometimes not. There was another piece of the story that had somehow eluded my American history books or my cognizance when I read them, but you'd think I would have remembered that.
Captives were very common, and there's a lot in the book that you write, as you say, just isn't in common currency. And even, you know, and the funny thing is, Texans, younger Texans like my daughter, they don't know it anymore. But yeah, a lot of captives. The captives who ended up, you know, if you were an adult, you were either killed or made a slave, basically, and that's what they did to other Indian tribes too. And it wasn't just the Comanches. Infants were usually killed because no one wanted to deal with them. And so you had this middle ground of children who were taken in. And there were Mexicans and of mixed blood, mestizos, and boys and girls of other Indian tribes. I mean, it was not just white people that happened to, but as long as we're still on the subject of things that people don't know, there's so many corners of this story that were a revelation to me, researching them as well as readers now reading them. For example, John Coffee Hayes. He was the greatest Texas Ranger. He was one of the greatest military commanders we ever produced. He was the origin, in fact, of a lot of those dime store novel myths that we came to know. I mean, he was the greatest Indian fighter on the frontier. And he was the man who adapted and, in fact, adapted the six-shooter, and in order to fight Comanches. And so you have this amazing tale of the rise of the Rangers who imitated Comanche fighting methods and adapted this peculiar five-shot thing that this bankrupt guy named Samuel Colt had made. And they saved Colt. I mean, Colt, of all people. And you think of Mackenzie again as he's the greatest Indian fighter. Nobody's ever heard of him. Quanah, nobody's ever heard of him. Jack Hayes, nobody's ever heard of him. We just keep going through the book. Of all the people, nobody's ever heard of.
One of the centerpieces, I think, of your book is that you're telling these smaller stories about individuals that you just mentioned, and we'll come back and talk about some of them. But then there's the big story, which is that of the Comanches and how that they play into the development eventually of the American West. You have called this tribe, the Comanche tribe, the most powerful in American history.
Right.
Why?
It's interesting. It's an interesting point. Some people have asked me, they said, well, does that mean that if you put a Comanche warrior against a Sioux warrior, or if they fought a pitched battle on a field, the Comanches would win? And who knows? The Sioux were awesome warriors, and there were plenty of other Plains tribes that were. What I mean by powerful is the ability to change or influence history. In that sense, I don't think anybody comes close. And the reason is that the big picture of the Comanches are they're the tribe that will kind of really tell you everything about how the South Plains opened to American and Anglo-European settlement coming in. They were this enormous barrier that everybody had to deal with. They blocked the Spanish from coming north. They blocked the Mexicans. They blocked the French moving west out of Louisiana. They accounted for the rise of the Texas Rangers. They stopped the entire frontier, American frontier, for 40 years along a single line. Nobody ever did anything like that. So you had this sort of principle sitting there, this on 250,000 square miles of land that nobody could figure out. And it went long. It went. You know, you would think that for example, let's say during the Civil War, where both sides unleashed the greatest carnage with the biggest guns and the most every firepower that had ever been done before. Even after the Civil War, it took 10 years to finally force Comanches onto a reservation. So it's this enormous power principle sitting there that if you start to read about it, will sort of teach you how Texas got founded and why the Rangers came up. And you can go farther than that and say that, Texas itself is a result of a misguided attempt to stop Comanches, because what happened was the Mexicans said, in order to stabilize their northern frontier, they let the rednecks in from Alabama and Tennessee. Okay,
yeah, right. You could live there. We don't want to.
That's right. And it's an old technique, stabilize your frontier by settling it. So they said, well, let these guys settle it, and it sort of backfired on them, at the Battle of San Jacinto and when Texas got its independence. But you can kind of keep going with it. But it's the backstory, the big backstory that you're talking about is the reason that really I think the Comanches are a great story. They tell you about what happened.
And that the West really wasn't truly won until
they lost it. Exactly. We won until only after they lost, because there was nothing was moving, and you would have thought, and there were lots of you would have thought that what might have happened was what happened with almost every single other American Indian tribe. They were steamrolled pretty quickly. The firepower offset was too great. Not these guys.
You've been asked about this before, but I think it bears asking again. You talk about violence and you depict it right from the very start. And that is what I mean to say is the violence perpetrated by Native Americans on each other and on non-natives. And it is explicit. So this is something I know that you felt was important, that while we hear a lot about tribes being victims, they were also extremely powerful in their own right and involved in war.
They were warlike. I think that one of the biggest surprises to me in terms of reaction to my book is I was being interviewed on radio at one point, and somebody said, Sam, did you have to really sit down and take a deep breath before you wrote a complete revisionist history of Native Americans? And I just looked at him and I thought, what are we talking about here? I didn't understand it. I now do. What he meant was that I'd say in the 60s is roughly when it happened, there was kind of a shift in the sentiment about the way we felt about Native Americans. And Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee would be kind of the emblem of it. But it was the sense that they were kind of nice, docile, peaceful, that they just wanted to live their lives, and the great American, cultural military machine just rolled over them and destroyed them in a series of hundreds of broken treaties and all that. It's a familiar story. A lot of that is absolutely true. What is not true was that the Indians were, not powerful or not good at war or not warlike. They were. And if you go back to the 5 civilized tribes they were the tragic ones because they'd adopted white man's ways and they were being, driven from the southeast across into Oklahoma in spite of the fact that they were trying to get along. But if you go back to the early Choctaws and Chickasaws and Seminoles and Creeks and people like that, they were violent. They were good warriors. And so what I tried to do is, and I was not trying to push against that myth at all. I wasn't even aware of it, that I was doing it. But by just saying, look, these are warlike folks. They fight each other. They were fighting each other before we got here. It was a way of life. They did to each other what they did to white people later. The difference was that when they did it to white people, these were people of the Industrial Revolution, of the Enlightenment. This was the group that was now horrified. A Crow or a Ute would not have been horrified if one of their warriors had been taken and tortured by Comanches, just as the Comanches would not have been horrified as if the Utes would take the Comanche man and torture him, which they would have done. That was okay. Things were going along. They were hunting the buffalo. It was a sustainable ecosystem. They fought each other. They did raids. The only difference is you enter the Anglo-Europeans. That's the difference. So it's a question of point of view, I guess.
Well, let's talk about some of the Anglo-Europeans. Riveting story here of Cynthia Ann Parker, you've already mentioned, a 9-year-old girl who was taken by the Comanches, ultimately married a Comanche and had Quanah and 2 other children. She spent 24 years with the tribe, was discovered a few times by people and said, no, I do not want to leave.
Which was shocking to white settlers at the time. Because captives were taken and captives were exchanged. And in fact, captives in her position, were often exchanged. Well, not in her position, but often, say, adult women were taken and brought back, and it was a badge of shame because people imagined what had been done to them. And all
Didn't
this
even
thing.
have to imagine. Some of these young ladies wrote about what
Some
happened
of them,
to
well,
them.
Rachel did, yeah.
Which is amazing.
Yes, but yeah, it was a shocking thing that she wanted to stay. People couldn't believe it.
And do you think it was some sort of what we now call Stockholm Syndrome, where you start identifying with your captors, or do you believe that she really...
I think it's partly, it's interesting because if you look at Cynthia Ann and her son Quanah, they're two of the most brilliant cultural adapters of the American West. Unbelievable what they did. All the evidence suggests that she was happy in her life, that she had let the old one go. Her son, after the surrender of the Comanches, became I think the greatest Indian of the post-surrender years, or the reservation years, and then beyond that, he was wealthy, he was affluent, he was influential, he led his tribe, he testified, he outwitted senators in testimony in Washington, he outwitted Texas cattlemen in leasing games. I mean, he was a remarkable man, but Quanah took that moment of the surrender and adapted completely to the white culture. The interesting thing about Cynthia Ann is she adapted brilliantly to Comanche culture, but she was asked to do it twice. Think about it. When she was taken when she was 9, recaptured when she was in 1860, in her 40s. She did it once after she was 9, and then she was dragged back into civilization in Texas and asked to do it again. So you say, well, they're brilliant, but they're not. She wasn't quite that brilliant.
You got a little bit ahead of me, as I was going to say. She was asked a couple times when she was discovered to leave, and she said no. And then ultimately, she was told, "You're leaving," because they recaptured her.
They took her.
The world had changed completely from the 24 years since she had originally been taken. Her story seems to me to be one of the saddest I have ever read.
It's amazing.
That she tried over and over again to get back to the tribe, to the point where her family just kept moving her. And
Ever
in a
eastward.
particularly poignant scene, she was introduced to a former captive, who spoke the language, and all of a sudden opened up and thought, oh, maybe this is my chance if I can convince him in the native dialect to take me back to the tribe. And that never occurred.
I do think it is one of the saddest stories of the West. She really, I mean, when she was taken, she wept and she mourned and she cut herself and she tried to escape every chance she got. And then the Parker family, which is a very prominent family in Texas, didn't really know what to do with her, so they kept kind of shuffling her from one relative to another, and generally away from the plains, farther eastward into the piney woods of East Texas. And and she never saw her son again, and she lost her daughter, and it's someone who could never go back, and there was never any way she could.
Well, let's talk about her son, Quanah, who was not captured when she was, and went on to, as you say, become one of the great warriors. Describe his skills, what made him so unique, and is there any other parallel like him of an individual?
He was from what we know of him, he was a great warrior. He was the son of a chief, and from the descriptions of his father was a big man. The Comanches were not big in stature. They were brilliant horsemen, and they were brilliant warriors, but they weren't tall, as some of the Northern Plains tribes were.
But his mom was kind of tall, and
he was. Yeah, exactly. And so you get his father, Nakona, was very big. All the descriptions of him, a very big, muscular man. Cynthia Ann, as far as we know, is 5'8" or 5'9", and 140. She's been described that way. So we're talking a strapping pioneer woman. She marries Nakona, and they have Quanah. And the pictures of Quanah you can see. There's a couple in my book where you can just see the massive biceps and forearms on the guy. He was a piece of work.
In addition to his physical prowess, though, he was extremely smart, always one step ahead and from the band of Comanche that were the most, that stayed out the longest.
Yeah, right. He was part of this Quahatis that were the one that were the most aloof, way up in the Texas Panhandle by Amarillo, if you know that part of the state. Yeah, he was a brilliant man. And one of the things, it's interesting, people have asked me how a man like this could adapt so well. And when I say adapt, I mean, he wasn't a sellout at all. I mean, he wore his hair long in braids. He kept his 7 wives.
You're talking about
he kept
after
his
he was
peyote rituals. Yeah, I'm doing a right. He was not a sellout. What he was, though, he was a very clever man, and he was very good at building consensus. The people have said, well, how can this guy make this step out of the wilds when he's on horseback, making raids and killing people, and suddenly he's in a teepee in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, on a reservation. What's he going to do? And I said, I think there's something about Quanah. There's one of the things that if you were Comanche, the Comanches had a totally flat kind of organization. You had, you could, if you were an enterprising young man, you could become a war chief. All you had to do was recruit a party. That was the whole deal. If you could recruit 100 or 200 people, you could go take revenge on the Utes or whatever you wanted to do. Quanah was brilliant at that. He was brilliant at consensus, at getting people to trust him, getting people to follow him, a leader. And I think if you look at a person who's a civic leader, although it's not as boring, not as romantic, and it's a lot more boring than leading a war party on the plains, some of those skills are the same. You want to be able to trust the person. You want to be your confidence. You want to have confidence in the person's judgment, the person's skill. I mean, all those things, I think, personal skills.
But it is confusing, at least it was for me, that this warrior who held out and held out and held out, in the book, it seems that he, whether it was from a vision quest or whatever, he exceeded he gave in a pretty docile way.
When he did. He was the last one. I mean, there was a couple of straggling. He was the last one to come in, and when he took his people in only when they were starving to death, and the reason they were starving to death is the white man had killed all the buffalo. So he comes in, they never would have found him. Really, they tried. They couldn't. I mean, he was out there. He came in. When he made that decision, it's a very interesting part of his life. It was a vision. He had a vision. And the vision was he was going to sort of take the white man's road and lead his tribe that way. And it was a vision that sustained him.
Because he had hated white men.
Hated him more
because they took away
killed his father.
Everything he loved.
Took his mother.
Even though he's half white.
And moreover, there are, there's so much of Native American life you cannot see into because there aren't records of it, but there were raids made into the Texas Hill Country around the time that Quanah was doing it. And he would have been on some of those raids coming down from the Texas Panhandle. There were some of the most brutal ever done by Comanches. I guarantee you he was on some of those raids. I can't prove it, but that was the era. He was a war party leader. And this was that guy. So yeah, when he said, I'm gonna take this road, it was a vision that took it to do it.
And as you say, he became a rancher. He lobbied in
Big
Congress.
Time rancher.
He even started a school district. He even had Teddy Roosevelt to dinner.
Yeah.
He almost seems like a guy who today would be on talk shows. You know what I mean? He embraced technology. I'm just wondering if you consider him a hero.
Absolutely.
Whatever that word means to you.
Absolutely. A great American hero. And
American.
Well, absolutely. One of the greatest to me. And he was in every way. And his greatness, I think, we couldn't see him all the time. We saw him very rarely when he was a Comanche. I mean, when he was with the tribe before their surrender in 1875. But we really could see him after that. We could see what he did. He indeed made a fortune. He gave all of it away to his people. He was known as a healer. He had at any moment, he built this big house, and he had, at any moment around that house, there were dozens, or if not more, teepees of people who had come to Quanah for help. He was a brilliant, generous leader, a good man with a deep and generous spirit, and it wasn't given to him. He fought. It's like Lincoln. I admire Lincoln very much too, but Lincoln had to fight every minute of his political career. So did Quanah. Quanah was never. He was challenged by other politicians in the tribe, but he was. Yes, I absolutely think he was a great man. The only people who object to what he may have done as a raider, and I'm sure he did that. Well, that's just a part of his life. He was a Comanche. That's what Comanches did.
He has lots of descendants because he had many wives.
Yes.
And I've seen a great picture of you with one of them, a great-great-granddaughter.
Yeah.
What's been their reaction to the book about
the descendants?
Yes.
Oh, some of them, a number of them have come to the book signings and liked it. Some of them don't. There are things that they don't agree with in my book that, for example, the death of Quanah's father. I explain in my book the Comanches have Quanah had a different version of it than is in my book, and the Comanches believe him and not me. I really believe I'm right, and I document why I think I'm right. So the Comanches don't agree with that or like that. From a number of them, I've gotten just that they feel it's certainly respectful to the tribe, and that they thought it was interesting. Some of them didn't know some of the details, and some of them aren't crazy about it. So I can't, it's. There are about 14,000 Comanches now, as far as I can tell, and it's impossible to poll them, and in various degrees of blood and relationships to the tribe. But anyway, I think from my own point of view, it was a book essentially about what an extraordinary people they were.
And how did writing this book transform you?
You live in your landscape as a person wherever you are. You live in Boise, or you live in, as I do, in Austin, Texas, or something, and you try to understand the world in which you live in your own sort of way. But I moved to Texas, and as I say, the Connecticut Yankee comes down, doesn't know much, but I love the plains, and I love Texas, and I guess to be able to understand, to be able to go that deep into your own place where you live, was something that just changed the way I looked at everything. I'd never done that with anything. I've been a journalist. I've done stories about lots of things, but I've never gone that deep into a place, if you will. And to some extent, this book is about my love affair with the Great Plains, with West Texas. So I think that, more than anything, I feel that part. I feel the landscape, the land, and the sense of what happened on it. Well,
thank you. Thank you for taking time to talk about your work, and I look forward to reading your next book.
Yeah, I do too. We'll see.
You've been listening to Sam Gwynne, the author of Empire of the Summer Moon. His next book is titled Rebel Yell and is about General Stonewall Jackson, who led Confederate troops during the Civil War. To learn more about that book, check out my web extra with Mr. Gwynne. You'll find it by going to idahoptv.org and clicking on Dialogue. That's also where you can watch this interview again or find past conversations from the Sun Valley Writers Conference. I'd like to thank the organizers of that conference for finding time in the authors' schedules for their interviews, and thank you for tuning in. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.